Alright, for this lecture we're going to talk about the epidermis and the types of cells that you would find in it. Just as a reminder, the epidermis is the layer of epithelial tissue that is most superficial on your skin. And it has several layers called stratum. And you're going to find different types of cells in different layers. These are the four main types of cells, and by far the most common is what's called a keratinocyte. A keratinocyte is an epithelial tissue cell. They range from being cuboidal to being squamous, depending upon what layer they're found in, but by far most of them are squamous. And they are specialized epithelial cells in that they make this tough, fibrous protein called keratin. And that keratin protein eventually begins to fill up the entire cell until the cell actually dies from basically being full of keratin. This is one of the features that gives your skin its resilience, its ability to resist stress and tearing, and its resistance to damage and its waterproofing. Second, we have melanocytes. Melanocytes are specialized cells usually found in the stratum basale, which is the deepest layer of the epidermis. And melanocytes make these granules of melanin, which is a pigment. And there's several different types of melanin that we'll talk about in our skin color lecture, but these are the pigments, or these are the main pigments that give your skin its characteristic color. And it's not there just for variety or something like that. It's there specifically because the color granted by the melanin granules blocks ultraviolet light. And ultraviolet light can cause mutations. It doesn't have much penetrating value, so it tends to only cause mutations in, your skin. But you would be much more susceptible to skin cancer if you did not have melanin granules. And in fact, there are some people who don't have any melanin. Albinos have a genetic deficiency where they cannot make melanin, and they are extremely vulnerable to burning in the sun, even in relatively what we would think of as mild sunlight, and they're also extremely susceptible to skin cancer if exposed to the sun. So the melanin granules do a lot to protect you from UV radiation. Melanocytes don't they don't make melanin and then keep it all to themselves. If they did, well, you don't have that many melanocytes. You just have little dark patches, and some people have that. They're called freckles. With freckles, the melanocyte doesn't keep everything to itself, but it has a smaller radius over which it spreads them. So what the melanocyte does is it grows these arms, and it basically deposits these melanin granules in nearby keratinocytes. And there are several genetic components and environmental components of skin color that we'll talk about later. But certainly the extent to which, the radius over which each melanocyte deposits these granules is one of them. Right down here, we have a Langerhans cell, and these are also called dendritic cells. And they are immune system cells. They're technically a type of blood cell, so they're a connective tissue cell. But they are a modified immune system cell that basically gets embedded in the epidermis. They also grow these long projections, these long tentacular projections that go out there. And what they are is they're your body's border guards, right? They're looking for anything that's trying to get through your skin, some virus or bacteria or toxin. And if they detect something trying to get through your skin, then they will, first off, eat it, and secondly, alert your immune system that there is a potential invader. They also respond to any sort of damage to the epidermis, because anytime there's damage, it basically means that you're at higher risk of infection. So they're your body's first line of defense for things trying to come into it through your skin. These are found mostly in the stratum granulosum and the and in the middle portions of the epidermis. And they're not super common, but not super rare either. The fourth type of cell that you're going to find in the epidermis is called a tactile disk, or a tactile cell, or a Merkel cell. And these are specialized cells that respond to deformation. So when you're touched, or when anything applies pressure to your epidermis, it distorts the cells. When a Merkel cell is distorted, it stimulates a nerve ending that it rests on top of. So if you'll recall, in our last lecture, we talked about the tactile disks, or Merkel disks, and these were nerve endings that convey senses of light touch. And it isn't actually the nerve ending itself that detects the light touch. It is the Merkel cell that detects the touch, and when it detects touch, it stimulates the nerve ending underneath it. So this is basically just what I was telling you about. One addendum that I want to add. So keratinocytes make up about 90% of the cells. Keratinocytes also are regenerative. You are constantly generating new keratinocytes, and old ones are constantly dying. So your skin is constantly renewing itself. At least the epidermis of your skin is constantly renewing itself. And most keratinocytes don't actually divide, or don't divide very often. But in the stratum basale, the lowest level of the epidermis, you have specialized keratinocytes called keratinocyte stem cells, and those are the ones that divide. And as they divide, they push out new keratinocytes that basically go upwards to the next stratum above them, and that is what pushes cells up and out. The rate of their division can be very variable, depending upon the amount of stress that is applied to the skin. If you have a lot of stress to your skin, like let's say you're a construction laborer, so you're working with your hands all the time, you're out there all the time, you're doing work that is very abrasive to your skin, your keratinocyte stem cells are going to divide more quickly. And that's because you've basically got more stress that's causing you to lose keratinocytes faster. On that note, let's talk about birth to death, the life history of a keratinocyte, right? So we said that they come from these stem cells. There's a stem cell in the stratum basale, and when it divides through mitosis, it migrates away. Now, mitosis is very energy intensive, and if you'll recall, epithelial tissue is not highly vascularized. When we talked about the structure of the skin, there's no blood vessels, no capillaries in the epidermis. But remember that the dermal papilla, that papillary layer of the dermis, is very highly vascularized and has lots of capillaries in it. So the stratum basale, which is closest to that dermal papilla, has easy access to all of those oxygen and nutrients. And so that's where you have the very metabolically active dividing cells. When they divide, some of those cells basically, so you have like, let's say you have, that's a ridge and that's a dermal papilla there. That's a ridge, then we'll go up there. And here you have lots of blood capillaries coming in here. And in this lowest level here, you've got your stratum basale, and this is where you'll find the keratinocyte stem cells. And so this right here perhaps is a stem cell, and since it's a stem cell, it divides by mitosis, and so when it does that, it'll divide into, I'm going to put the new cell in blue. All right, it divides along its horizontal axis, so it'll make a new cell above it. And let's say that this over here is a stem cell as well, and so when it divides, it makes another cell above it. They can also divide side to side, making new stem cells, but these new cells that I have here in blue are just going to be normal keratinocytes. And as it divides, it's putting new cells further away. So this new cell here does not have as easy access to the nutrients. So it's going to have a slower metabolism. It's going to, basically have to, it can't grow as fast. It certainly isn't going to be able to have enough energy to go through mitosis. As you go through and you keep dividing, every time you divide, you push the cells up. And as cells get pushed up, they become flatter and flatter. So in the stratum basale, they start out as basically cuboidal. And then as they get pushed up through the layers of the epidermis, they become more and more and more squamous as they go through. So over time, the keratinocytes flatten. They also, they start out, they're keratinocytes, they start out with some keratin in them. So, little bit of keratin. And then as they move up, they make more and more and more keratin in them until, towards the top, they're basically just filled with keratin. So it takes about 30 to 40 days for a keratinocyte to move from just having been born in the stratum spinosum, the second layer here, and this is mostly stratum spinosum, to moving all the way through the spinosum to the granulosum, and then to the surface of the skin, the stratum corneum. Along this process, it continues to make more and more and more keratin. Its metabolism continues to slow down, and eventually it dies. And the outer layer of your skin, the stratum corneum and the stratum lucidum in thick cells, thick skin, are dead keratinocytes. And then once they get pushed off of there, they basically flake off as dust. So it takes 30 to 40 days on average to go from brand bright new keratinocyte to dead keratinocyte flaking off of your skin. Like I said, this method, or this process is variable in its speed. If you have a lot of stress on your skin, injuries or lots of abrasion or something like that, it happens faster. This is part of what goes into the buildup of calluses. You basically have a much faster rate of making new keratinocytes, but the old ones aren't flaking off any faster. So you have a buildup of dead keratinocytes on your skin, and that's what goes into making a callus or a corn. And as with many things, this process becomes less and less efficient as you age. So older people are going to have this process occur much more slowly, and thus they will have fewer layers to their epidermis and thinner skin. And this is one reason why older individuals tend to have thinner, more fragile skin that's more prone to tearing. There's a few important things that a few important things that happen in a keratinocyte, and most of them happen in the stratum granulosum, right? So just to remind you, this is our epidermal ridge and their dermal papilla, all right? And we've got several layers of cells coming off. The first layer is the basale. And then you have several layers above that where they get kind of spiky looking and flatten out. And this is the spinosum. And then you have a thin layer that's like 1 or 2 cells thick. And yeah, they're pretty squamous cells by this point, so they're like that. And this is called the stratum granulosum because under the microscope they look like they have these dark granules in them. And then above the granulosum you have the dead skin layers of the corneum. And the lucidum in thick skin. And the main lifestyle transition for keratinocytes happens in this granulosum. The granules are made of a protein called filigrin. And they've been making keratin this whole time, right? So you get more and more and more keratin, but the keratin is just sort of spread out in a net. And it is a less efficient way for the keratin to be bound. What filigrin does is it's going to take these keratin fibers, right? They're going kind of any which way. Filigrin, and it's going to bind all of them together in a tight bundle like that. And so it takes a bunch of keratin and it binds it into these tight bundles. That's going to make the keratin much tougher and stronger. It's also going to start displacing internal cell organelles. The cells also produce these envelope proteins underneath their membranes, which are tough, and they go into making the cell tougher and stronger and more resistant to stress. And underneath the membrane, you have vesicles. Remember, vesicles are those little soap bubbles of membrane. And what they do is they meld with the plasma membrane, the cellular membrane, and they release lipids onto basically the surface of your skin. Not quite the surface of your skin, it's underneath the stratum corneum. So I'm going to put them in here in green here. So as your stratum granulosum cells die, they release this lipids underneath the corneum. This lipid is, well, remember, oil and water don't mix, so it provides a protective coating that helps to waterproof your skin. And you also have oil glands or sebaceous glands that secrete sebum, which is another liquid. They secrete it to the top of the skin, on top of the corneum. Now that's going to be sebum. And so in most of your skin, the corneum isn't very thick, right? So in thin skin, which is the vast majority of your body, the corneum isn't very thick, so you've got your sebum up top, you've got a little corneum layer, and then you've got your lipid layer underneath. They kind of make a little sandwich. It's a very tight sandwich. It works very good at preventing water from getting through. Neither of these layers acting by themselves is a perfect water barrier. And mostly, what they exist to do is to prevent water from actually getting out of your body. You've got water in your body, you don't want to lose it. They also act to prevent water from getting into your body, not because you don't want water to get into your body, but because water can carry things like toxins and infectious particles, and you want those to be stopped at the surface of your skin. But most of us are probably familiar with the idea that you get into a bath and you sit in there for a long time, and what do you end up with? You end up with prune fingers, right? And you get wrinkly fingers, you get wrinkly toes. Maybe if you stay in long enough, you get some wrinkles on your palms. You don't usually get wrinkles on, like, your thigh or your elbow or something like that. So why is that? And the reason is that, remember that the skin on your palms and on your plantar surface is thick skin. So in that area, let's go thick skin here. So here we have thick skin. With thick skin, your corneum, that's your dead skin cell layer. So these are all dead cells filled with these filigrenated keratin bundles, by the way. And then you have your sebum up top from your oil glands. And underneath, you have the lipid layer from your granulosum. And basically, as the cells in the granulosum release this lipid mixture that spills out and waterproofs the area underneath the corneum, that's effectively when the keratinocytes die. And they move up into the corneum or the lucidum. And their organelles degenerate, and they basically just become sacs of tough keratin. But here's the important thing for why your fingers prune. Neither of these barriers is perfectly watertight. They work together to increase the amount of water tightness that you have, but For instance, the sebum is not perfectly watertight, so water will still come in there and into the stratum corneum, but will have a harder time passing this second lipid layer from the granulosum. So the water gets trapped in between these two lipid layers, and these dead cells, well, they're dead and they're dry, but they still contain a lot of proteins in them, and they can absorb water. And so what they do is they absorb this water and they swell up. So the cells will actually fill with water and swell up, and that's what causes your fingers to prune. That's because this waterproofing layer from the stratum granulosum is occurring underneath the corneum, so you don't get full waterproofing until after the corneum. The corneum, the dead skin cells, are actually what's absorbing water and pruning up. A lot of people think that the pruning is because you're actually like losing water. It isn't. It's because your corneum is filling up with water and becoming more puffy. All right, so that is the epidermis and the cells in it and the life cycle of a keratinocyte. You most particularly need to know the 4 cells that comprise the epidermis. You need to know what layers they're likely to be found in. You need to know their functions, and you need to know particularly the 4 events in the stratum granulosum that occur as a cell is transitioning through the stratum granulosum to the lucidum and the corneum. So they produce filigrin, which binds their keratin together. They produce tough envelope proteins that help to protect the cells. They release a lipid mixture that goes to waterproofing underneath the stratum corneum, and then they die. Pretty important event.